Welcome again to Anthropology 127, Archaeological Sciences. This is segment 4 of the first lecture, talking a bit about the history of the discipline, how we got archaeology going. So I'm going to share screen and we'll go and keep at this. Okay. Last time, we were thinking about where the idea of prehistory came from, the idea that there was a deep past for the Earth, and just possibly a deep past for humans as well. So we ended up with Marianning and ichthyosaurs, deep time stratigraphy, and now getting to the question of humans. Are humans also part of this deep past? And around 1800, a member of the Royal Society, John Frere, that's the picture, went to a stone quarry, gravel quarry in southern England. And there he found early stone tools, hand axes, which you get illustrated here, in a gravel quarry. He also found the bones of extinct hippopotamuses. And it was pretty clear that hippopotamus had not lived in Thames Valley for quite a long time. So he made the correct assumption that stones and the bones went together and that humans had been present a really long time ago. No idea exactly how long, but far, far back further than 4004 BC. And they had perhaps eaten those extinct animals. He publishes his finds. And oh my gosh, what a possible outcome for a scholar. As far as we can tell, nobody read them. It wasn't until a history archaeology project in the 1960s that people came across this and went, oh my God, he proved right there. And people didn't pay attention. It was an issue of being a little too early for his time. There's also an issue of context. For modern archaeologists, going to gravel quarry and poking around and finding, bits and pieces mixed together in the detritus is not really the best way of doing it, because you don't really know that the association between the stones and the bones, their connection, is valid. Suppose, if you will, that the animal bones are falling out of a lower strata and the hand axes are falling out of one 20 feet above. That doesn't mean they're the same time period. In fact, it strongly suggests the hand axes are a later period. It's not what happened, but that would be how a modern archaeologist would critique this or at least worry about it. What happened in terms of understanding how deep past was had a lot to do with controversy. The great controversies between the catastrophists and the uniformitarianists. Now, catastrophism was the idea that the Earth had gone through a whole series of great catastrophes like the biblical flood, which almost wiped out all animals and plants, and that this is why you see these dramatic changes in the stratigraphy of the Earth, trilobites, dinosaurs, and so on. And Baron Cuvier, who had a very colorful life as one of Napoleon's diplomats, changed sides at exactly the right moment, landed on his feet and became the head of the Musée Naturel in Paris. And he was a world-famous anatomist and osteologist, dealing with both modern animals and also fossils. He also did extensive description of stratigraphy in Europe and elsewhere. So he put forward the idea that the biblical flood was just the latest in a whole series of great catastrophes. Now, about the same time, the Englishman Charles Lyell, that's his picture there, put forward a very different view. This was an idea of uniformitarianism, which is to say that all the processes which we can see today of gradual erosion of glaciers retreating and expanding, seacoasts changing their shape, this is all happening slowly. And this is happening throughout time. And that's what causes all the observed changes we can see in the detailed geological record. So, no catastrophes. Instead, what you're talking about here is these very gradual changes. Now, this, of course, means that you need a lot more time to make this work. Now, the catastrophists didn't believe in 4004 either. They thought the Earth was much older than that. But as you can see, the process of change, if it's dramatic, catastrophes, doesn't necessarily require absolutely as much time as uniformitarianism did. So there you go. So uniformitarianism was popularized by Lyell's book, The Principles of Geology, which you see illustrated here. It was a bestseller. And this was a period, of course, when there weren't the same sort of disciplinary boundaries that there are today. So people who were literary scholars, who were churchmen, would pick up a book like this and read it with great interest. One of the people who did was the young Charles Darwin, setting out on his voyage around the world in the Beagle, and he took this book with him. And as he said, he started out from England has a convinced catastrophist, and by mid-Atlantic he'd been converted over to Uniformitarianism, and so it went. And he hopped off and did some dinosaur hunting when he got to Patagonia. So we have then this really influential book, which was both a theory book and also a method book. And in this is a lot of information about how to document stratigraphy, how to draw it, how to keep track of it, which turned out to be very relevant, not just for the deep time of the dinosaurs, but for the shallower time of the human past. So the principle of geology was a big deal. And the fact that uniformitarians won probably was a good thing for archaeology. Although, thought question. Thinking about modern understanding of Earth history, who's right? Yeah, big rocks in space do seem to come in. We've had major extinction events taking place. It's arguably we're having the 6th extinction taking place now. So Cuvier wasn't so wrong after all. But it's okay. We wound up getting a long time, that said. Another interesting character is Boucher de Perez, who was another Napoleonic soldier. He had been a military engineer, so he had been trained in drafting and in measurement, which turned out to be really relevant. Boucher de Perez was a customs collector in northern France, and he was underworked, overpaid. It was a good job. He observed many eroded riverbanks, and he found many situations where stone tools and bones of extinct animals, either totally extinct like woolly rhinoceroses or locally extinct like reindeer, were found. And he drew them again and again. So he had a really good record. He also was on the post road between Calais and Paris, so that anybody traveling from Britain to visit their friends in Paris and give papers almost always found a reason to stop off at Boucher de Perez and chat, because apparently he had a wonderful cook, a great wine cellar. He was a lot of fun. And then after dinner, they'd all go and look at his finds. So as a result, people knew all about what he had done and his cool results long before he got around to publishing his great book, Celtic and Antediluvian Antiquities, in 1847. So Boucher de Perez had a major influence on people thinking about the depth of the human past. Now, also happening at the same time period is people trying to sort out these cabinet of curiosities. So the Danish National Museum was founded in 1805, 1808, and this was the earliest archaeological museum in Europe and, in fact, the world. So it's still there. You can visit right now. There it is. It was in a disused palace, which the king had soon out. And the collections have gotten so big that this is only one of a series of museums which were created out of the Cabinet of Curiosities. The Zoological Museum, which turned into a Natural History Museum, was one of them. The Geological Museum, Geological Institute, that was another one. And here's the one which is just about the archaeology. So Christian Thomsen was a Danish businessman who was hired to make some sense out of this collection. I remember they had virtually no context information. This is materials have been turned in for centuries and piled up. These are the things that the two ambassadors looked at several hundred years before. So what to do with it? And especially what to do, because there's a big opening ceremony about to happen, which the king, his patron, was going to attend. So it turned out he had 3 big exhibit halls to work with. And what he did was he sorted out his collection by material. So stone in one hall, bronze in another, iron in a third. And when the king remarked that surely there must have been an age of stone, an age of iron, an age of bronze, because who would use a stone dagger if they had a bronze one? Who would go on using a bronze one if they had iron? And he draws a correct conclusion. You're seeing technological change through time. So the very next day, they came out with the catalog, which then has the Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, and the king's was influential because we still use those terms today. So the idea that you can see technological change happening through time from these museum collections, and this is a way of sorting out these museum collections and making sense of them, that was a big deal. Especially good was the fact that Thomsen's friend, Vorsey, Christian Vorsey, was a landowner outside of Copenhagen and had a whole bunch of archaeological sites as property and has workmen dig them up and discovered that, yep, you're right. The stone is below the bronze is below the iron. So the connection between fieldwork and museum collections was forged early and was important. So in the first years of archaeology, this connection between museum collections and fieldwork was really key. And then you have more controversy. This is in 1856. A German school teacher, who's also an antiquarian enthusiast, discovers the Neanderthal finds. in the Neanderthal Valley, which is where the name comes from. This, we know, is not the first find of Neanderthal bones. They turn up in several cabins of curiosity dating back to the 1500s, so they just weren't recognized as anything but just curious. But now, in the mid-19th century, this German school teacher realizes that this is really important because these are not modern humans. The Rowridges, all the rest of it, they are something different. And the concept that humans could have evolved physically through time, as well as changing their technology through time from stone to bronze to iron, that's a big deal. And of course, Neanderthals are still controversial to this day. Are they these brutish subhuman creatures, or are they very much like modern humans? Are we related to Neanderthals? If so, how much? Things to think about later on. But again, Neanderthals were controversial from right the very beginning. Okay, then 1859, the year of miracles, Annus Mirabilis. This is the miraculous year for biologists because this is when Darwin publishes his Origin of Species and everything changes. This is also miraculous because Sir John Evans, in the picture here, a very, very establishment Victorian figure, president of the Royal Society, presents a new synthesis in a long address. Uniformitarianism, the Earth is very ancient. The three-age system of Thomson, his way of dividing up the past. Neanderthals exist and are real and are potential human ancestors. And the idea that there's deep time evolutionary change that affects humans, and the method of getting at that time is not the tools of history, but the tools of geology, of paying attention to superposition, paying attention to context, recording depth very carefully. This is revolutionary. So this is why this is this miraculous year for archaeology, as well as for biosciences. Okay, to summarize really quickly, these are some key 19th century people that we've just been looking at. And this is sort of giving you a bit of timeline. You're seeing the steps towards forming a profession. The cabins of curiosities and their curators, 1500, 1800, nobody's professional. Some of them were actually gardeners, who are pointed to this because, they dig. The avocational barrow diggers that my friend would like to go back and shoot from mid-18th and early 19th century. Royal Society of Antiquaries founding in 1754. The adoption of the methods from geology in the 19th century. The Evans synthesis in 1859. And then, importantly, museums of natural history, not history, natural history, speak the earth, which will teach you, it says, on several of them, are also archaeology museums, because archaeology initially is part of natural history. And these are forming from the early 19th century right down to the late 19th century, early 20th century. When does the American Museum of Natural History get one? 1877. So it's right in this time period. This is also a period when we have popularization taking place. The number of very colorful figures go out in the world, discover spectacular finds from the past, using some of the tools of archaeology, geology, and importantly, they publicize them. So this is a period when technological advance allows for the publication of wired pictures and drawings and eventually photographs, which really pumps up the Sunday supplement of national newspapers and becomes, lots of pictures. So this is a time things coming together. It's also a critical moment for a synthesis of popular book called, as we'll see, pre-historic times. Let's take a look at some of the popularization. Heinrich Schliemann was famous as a popularizer. He was a German type person. He was not a trained archaeologist or anything else much, but he was very good at self-promotion. Schliemann was convinced that the stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey, which he and most other Germans and other Europeans had learned as history, as literature rather than history, were real. That they at least talked about things that had actually happened in some extent. And he thought that if he went to the scene of where things happened, to Troy, to Mycenae, where Agamemnon and Priam came from, and dug him around, systematically you would find the remains of these ancient people, and he did. So he went first to Troy and dug big holes all over it, hired lots of workmen, did, by modern standards, a lot of damage, and he found things. He found this cluster of jewelry, probably female, not necessarily, maybe male too, which you can see here this lady is wearing. She is his wife, and she's illustrated wearing what he called the treasure of Priam. Priam, of course, the Iliad is King of Troy. And she went on wearing that as she and her husband walked right through customs and out of Turkey. So they stole it. This did not make the Turks happy, so Schliemann became persona non grata there, and instead went to Greece, where he dug up chunks of Mycenae and found equally spectacular things there, including this gold mask. You see, this is the mask of Agamemnon. This is, of course, the Greek leader that is in the Iliad. Now, of course, we have no idea that this is actually Agamemnon's mask or if Agamemnon is real. We do know that's not Priam's gold because it comes from a long time period. He wasn't paying enough attention to depth. And Schliemann generally was kind of a shady, sleazy character. So that if you get the Heinrich Schliemann Award from Archaeological Association today, it's not a compliment. However, Schliemann is really important because his publicization of himself, they were getting, daily bulletins, or at least weekly bulletins, coming back to the papers first in Germany, and then people of France and Britain and the US picked up on the story. So the time he was digging Mycenae, people were just waiting for the next great find, and he didn't disappoint. And because he was connecting us up to the literary stories, the Iliad and the Odyssey, the legendary stories that people knew as part of their education, it made sense. This wasn't just deep prehistory, but this was before history. It was before writing, but it was just on the edge of it. This is Homer. Wow, how cool was that? So he got a lot of enthusiasm going there. And arguably, Schliemann had a lot to do with the public demanding more archaeology and creating, ultimately, jobs in archaeology. Now, in the New World, Stephen and Catherwood, two New Yorkers, traveled to Chiapas in Yucatan in Mexico and discovered Maya ruins. The Maya people, of course, always knew they were there, but this was news to Europeans and Americans. And these iconic illustrations in watercolor and lithograph that Catherwood produced are still classics today, and they actually sometimes show buildings which no longer exist. So it's a really valuable record. But this image of these amazing cities where there's elaborate art style, just covered with jungle, really was impressive. And the idea of the lost city really took off from this. So this is mid-19th century again. Stevenson and Catherwood did quite well from this. And if you want, you can go to Dover Books and can buy their books still full of these wonderful illustrations. So this too created a real demand for more archaeology. And then there's John Lubbock. Lubbock is knighted eventually. He is a newspaper publisher originally, but he went ahead and produced a series of books called Pre-Historic Times. This is the first time that the term prehistory, with without hyphen, becomes commonplace, and people start using that in normal speech. Again, the first editions are coming in 1865. It goes through multiple editions. The last one was 1928. So if you go to a used bookstore in Manhattan, I'm pretty sure you can find a copy of one of these kicking around someplace. So you can see in these illustrations, it went through an evolutionary time, different time periods. But another thing to notice is that he's using ethnographic analogy. He's using Native American tools and weapons, stone tools, to equip his Stone Age Europeans, with the idea that it must have been at least something like that. And these creative illustrations really caught people's imagination. And again, there's some Neanderthals killing this poor woolly mammoth or woolly rhinoceros. Now, something else to notice is, especially in the Victorian era illustrations, our female ancestors, are always falling out of their clothes. So there's no question that this is part of the popularity here. So, okay, if soft porn is what it takes to sell books, that's what they did. Now, the alley-oop illustration here is just to also mention that this book is probably where the idea that cavemen and dinosaurs lived at the same time started. Because the later editions of Lubbock start really early and take you through dinosaurs to humans. And there's dinosaurs and humans not in the same picture, but on pages next to each other. So enterprising folks picked up on this, and early cartoons had alley-oop and dinosaurs together. And, well, who am I to be a spoil sport? But of course, they're millions of years apart in actual time. So Lubbock wound up being very influential in terms of how people thought about the past, and again, creating demand for archaeology. Now, importantly, this is also a period when people begin to systematically get trained as field archaeologists. Pitt Rivers, who was a British general and an engineer general, had gigantic holdings in southern England, which were also very rich in archaeology. And for many years, up to 1900, when he died, he had annual schools of archaeology where people would come from Oxford, Cambridge, and elsewhere, the United States, from Germany, and they would meet with each other. They would learn how to do scientific, systematic excavation, measuring everything in, producing a very detailed record of where things were found, really good context reporting. Re-excavation of some of Pitt Rivers' work in the 1960s demonstrated that his maps were accurate to the centimeter, which is pretty impressive even after all these years. So the archaeological field school then became part of the tradition of how you learn to do archaeology. And of course, it isn't just a case of learning how to dig, it's also learning how to get along with people and meeting people. So the friendships that came together, people meeting in these field schools, lasted for people's whole careers. And it had a lot to do with bringing together a cohesive body of archaeologists who shared common ideas and common field training. That's still true today. Field schools are really important. We run field schools when the virus isn't with us in Britain and in Iceland, and we will be doing more in the future. So if you want to do a field school, we can help. Okay, to end up with, this is a point where now we have the basis of archaeology together. We have archaeologists being able to get jobs. You don't have to be wealthy to be an archaeologist now. You can actually have a day job. And also initially in the early 20th century, first half of the 20th century, a lot of it's museum jobs. You know, if you think about Indiana Jones, you know, where does he work? He actually works in a university museum. That is to say, a museum attached to a university. So the teaching and the museum curation are connected up together. So big museums had tremendous influence, and they still do, in archaeology. The American Museum of Natural History, which you see on one side, the British Museum on the other side, both are these major centers for archaeological collections from all over the world. The Natural History Museum, interestingly, in New York, is about Native Americans. It's about non-Western cultures generally. When you start getting classical archaeology in New York, you have to go across the park, the metropolitan, which tells you something about how people thought about non-Western people being part of nature, part of natural history, and maybe not quite so human. These museums, of course, accumulate controversy as well as accumulating stuff. And the British Museum, as you know, has been involved in decades-long arguments about the British ownership of the Elgin marbles that came from the Parthenon and many other objects from other people's past. The statue you see Teddy Roosevelt in front of the American Museum is scheduled to move because of the dominating nature of the thing. And Roosevelt's descendants today have thought it's time for that to go too. So it's times have changed. And one of the things we'll talk about later in the class is how times are changing with how archaeologists interact with the people they study and who archaeologists are. And now we're not just old white guys, just a few of us. Increasingly, we are diverse. We are changing. And one of the things we'll talk about the rest of the course is some of those changes. But anyway, this gets you up to at least the 1950s or so, and we'll go from there in other lectures. So that's it for the first lecture, and I'm signing off now.